Hello to my fellow 2006 owners. If you're watching this video, I would think you have the famous rusty trim piece above the cab. Unfortunately, there are a good number of us out there. I will give you a little history about my rust problem. When I bought my 06H back in 2013, I saw the rust up there, but I did not know it was a common problem with this unit. In the spring of 2017, I had addressed some rust underneath the windshield. Since I had the windshield out to fix that up, I decided to attack the rusty trim at the same time. I have a small sandblaster, so I taped it off and blasted away all of the exposed rust on the trim piece. It looked good, and I proceeded to paint it. I elected to go with black paint just in case the rust came back. Fast forward to 2020, and the trim still looked great, but the caulk was starting to bleed rust through it. I had a loose headliner that I was reattaching, and I got to thinking, since I was so close to the trim piece, that I should go get that done the right way. First thing I do is to remove the screws that hold the gas pistons in place. I know some people will unclip the clip on the top of the piston to release it, but I find it much easier just to take the screws out. Whenever possible, I will put the screws back into the same holes so that I don't lose them. Once both pistons are off, you can remove the bed mattress. The easiest way I found to do this is put some blocking as far back as possible under the bed. Then you lower the front of the bed so that the back of the bed lifts upward. This is what disengages the bed. At this point, you should be able to pull the bed out. This is what the bed hinge looks like. There's a rod that rides in this cutout, and that acts like a hinge. When you lift the back of the bed up, you disengage the rod from the slot. Now you will remove the small wall in the front. There are 3 screws that hold it in place. This is a view of the front with the wall out. The window covering and the window frame will be the next thing to remove. Remove the screws from both the top and the bottom of the plastic slides. To do this, just slide the curtains front to back and you'll get through the screws. You do not have to remove the curtains from the plastic rails. Now unscrew the 12 screws from the window frame itself. The frame should come off with the screws out. Now, with a very small screwdriver, you can remove the plastic caps on the plastic wall covering. Then unscrew all the screws that hold the wall in place. The 2 snaps on the end cap must also be removed. All the screws on the top deck of the plastic should now be removed. You can now pull out the panel. Care must be taken to clear the overhead light. The overhead outlet will need to be disconnected. Mine is not stock anymore, so I can't remember what the stock one looks like. For mine, I had to disconnect all the wires. The hardest part of getting the panel out is to get the panel around the bed bracket. The panel will come out in one unit. At this point, you can remove the front deck. Winnebago has put in many staples there, but you'll be able to pull them right out. My deck was modified with a storage cabinet. So your deck will be full size to the front area. This next piece of video was shot right after I opened mine up. You'll be looking at the passenger side over the door. There we go. So this is what we have. Not sure, I think there's a seam back in here that the caulk's covering up and the brackets have to be removed. We'll find out. You can see a screw head right here. There's 2 screw heads on each bracket. I decided to dig in and see what was under the caulk. At first I chiseled around the brackets, but then I realized if I removed the bracket first, I could work much faster, and that's the way I did it on the rest of the job. save time, I speeded this video up, but you can still see what I had to do. I would say it took me about a half an hour to remove 90% of the caulk off of that passenger side. Then I moved to the front over the windshield. I removed the 3 brackets first, and then I went to remove the long stretches of caulk. As you can see, I used 3 chisels that I had for 90% of the work. I sharpened the chisels 3 times before the job was done. I can't express enough on how important it was to have a sharp chisel to do this work. The utility knife was only used to slice along the fiberglass edge after the caulk was removed in order to see the edge. I was able to pull out some very long runs of old caulk. Here you can see a long piece being held up in the air. If you look closely, you can see how much rust is coming up with it. Both corners were really rusted. Here is another one of the long pieces I had. This entire front took me less than an hour. After the front was done, I proceeded to the driver's side. I removed all of the caulk there. Again, that took me about a half an hour. With the caulk gone and the brackets gone, it's time to pull out all the screws around the perimeter of the trim. I decided to leave the 2 side piece trims in place and not worry about them because they weren't leaking. When I was done removing most of the caulk from the inside and the outside, I had a trash can full of old caulk. It was quite heavy, so I took it and weighed it. To my surprise, it was over 6 pounds of caulk. Now it was time to release the bond that held the trim to the fiberglass and the trim to the cab body. For this I used a rubber mallet, several putty knives, a utility knife, and a screwdriver. I worked on the trim to the fiberglass first. I first cut the caulk right at the seam with the utility knife, so my putty knife could enter the seam. Then I would tap on the putty knife to loosen an area up. Then I would put the screwdriver into that area to keep it separated so the putty knife could go into the next area easier. As you can see, I just walked the putty knife down the joint. This only took about 20 minutes to go around the entire length of the trim. It did not take much to break the trim loose. I did have a mark on the blade of the putty knife, so I knew how far to insert it in. I will add that no damage was done to anything by doing it this way. When I removed the trim to the cab body, I slid the putty knife between the two from the outside. I see I have no video or pictures of doing this, so I drew this diagram. Just like before, you can take the putty knife and keep it moving right down the joint. And then I went to the inside. I inserted the putty knife to make sure that I released all of the caulk. Once I thought I had the trim piece loose, I went outside and I could check to see if it was loose by pushing up on the fiberglass to see a separation of the fiberglass to the trim, and then pushed up on the trim to see if I could have a separation of the trim to the cab. There was one problem. I saw that the old caulk was loose. I could slide my putty knife at any spot and have it go through, but it was not always loose on the same surface. Sometimes the caulk was stuck to the fiberglass but loose on the trim, and other places it was stuck on the trim but loose to the fiberglass. I had to take a long blade knife and cut between the areas so that the trim was loose all the way around. Here on the inside you can see the end of the trim is completely loose. It was time to remove the trim. My wife Tony came out and it took very little effort to remove it. This is definitely a 2-person job to bring it down. As you can see here, the outer face was in pretty good shape. but the inner side was in very bad shape. It would only be a short time and the rust would have rusted through the trim. Here's a better look at the rust. This is a good cross-section of the end of the trim. Once the trim is out, you'll have gaps between the fiberglass and the cab. For mine, the driver's side was almost an inch wide, where the passenger side was only about 3/8 of an inch wide. At first I was worried about rain, but then looking at it, I didn't feel if it rained it would be a problem because it would take a lot to get it inside the RV. Now that the trim piece was removed, I could take it to the powder coater. On arrival at the powder coaters, I showed him the rust. He was very worried that by the time he blasted it to remove the rust, he figured it would be a 50-50 chance that the trim would have holes in it. Luckily, when I got it back, it did not have holes in it. I'm not really an expert on powder coating, but I read where you add extra zinc to the powder coating in rust areas. He said that he coated it 3 times with the extra zinc. I was very happy with the results. There were slight blemishes on areas where the rust was on the face, but overall it was great. This is a picture of one of the edges where it was rusted away. If you look closely, there's a shadow line on the white, and the shadow line shows you how ragged the edge is. While the trim was over at the powder coater, I had time to go back and really clean the surface up well. I used my chisel, some 3M pads, and some solvents to try to get the surface as clean as possible. So now it was time to figure out what everyone's talking about with this vinyl tube. Supposedly by putting the vinyl tube in, we'll supply a little resistance. Because the edge of the trim is flared up, the vinyl tube will keep that edge from digging into the fiberglass. In addition, when the trim touches the fiberglass, it also wears away the edge down to bare metal. And, or if that occurs, then it's going to rust again. On mine, there was an actual wear mark all the way around on the fiberglass where the trim edge was. I went out and bought some vinyl tubing. At first I thought 3/8 of an inch would be fine, but discovered it was way too thick. So I went to 5/16. 5/16 still looked like it was going to give me a problem compressing it up into that area. My solution was to go with a 1/4 inch outside dimension tubing that would be held in place with 2A tape. Unfortunately, to get the entire length done, you need about 10 foot 3 inches. So a roll of 10 foot is not going to make it. I wanted to go from end to end just for extra water seal. I could see with the 1/4 inch tubing and the 1/16 inch tape that it still was going to be somewhat of a compression problem. So what I did is I clamped it up and compressed the tube overnight so that when I was ready to use it in the morning, it would still be in some sort of a compressed state, and hopefully it would just expand back and be full thickness. I believe this clamping actually saved me one heck of a headache when it came time to install the trim. Well, the brackets were all off. I also addressed any rust issues that I had with them and painted them, made them fresh. I also addressed the little rust issue I had on the bracing above the fiberglass. The big day came and it was a hot summer day, so I pulled the RV under the tree for some shade. My brother and a friend came over to assist me installing it, and my grandson was there also. This all took place at the end of July in 2020, right in the middle of the COVID-19 pandemic, so we all wore our masks. I taped off around the cab to try to minimize the caulk squeeze out. I left the clamps on as long as possible to keep the tube compressed. Together, the three of us dry fitted it several times to make sure we knew what we wanted to do. I bought a 4-pack of Manus 75 sealant to do the job. If I made a major mistake, it would have been right here. This is where I put the caulk on the trim to the cab. An afterthought now is I should have put that bead up on the cab inside and slid this piece to the caulk instead of bringing the trim with the caulk to the cab. So I put the caulk on this side first, and then I flipped it over to put the caulk on the inside of what I call the rain gutter where the tubing is. I think I made 3 runs at the tube area, one on each side and one on top of the tube. I put a very generous amount of caulk in this area. Once all the caulk was in place, we lifted it up and carried it over. Here you can see us handling it. It was challenging not to get the caulk on your fingers. It went in place a lot smoother than I thought it would. Right here you can see why the caulk smeared right at the front posts. Once it was up, you still had to maneuver it to the right spot. Installing it was a messy job. We did get caulk all over the cab. To get it placed right, you had to have the right combination of upward movements and inward movements. My helpers pushed on it in several directions while I was inside trying to line the holes up. That was tricky. When you dry fit it, you can see where all the holes are. Once you put the caulk in, the caulk smears across the holes so you cannot see a lineup. The person inside has to do it all by feel. By hitting the old holes, you know you have it in the right place. I put the row of perimeter screws in first. From the time we pushed it up there and I went inside, I had all the perimeter screws in within 5 minutes. Once the perimeter screws are in, you really don't need help anymore. It was a bit challenging putting the brackets in place. When you remove them, they are all bent up, and I did straighten them out when I painted them. I did not mark each individual spot. I think they're basically universal, that I'd say you don't have to mark them, but you do have to bend them up a bit to get them back in place. The brackets probably took me another 20 minutes to install. The cleanup on the outside of the cab probably took a good hour. I really feel comfortable that it was cleaned well. Now it was probably the easiest part of the job, and that is just to add more caulk to the seam. As for the outside seam, I waited several days to make sure the air could get in there and dry everything out good. Then I put the 2 beads on the outside. After that, all you have to do is reinstall the inside cab area. Not as big of a pain in the ass as I thought it would be. I went into this somewhat blind. Yes, I saw something on the web that covered this switch out, but it was very vague. Now, with the help of this video, I hope it'll give confidence to other members to go and do this job. It took less time than I thought it would take. This video took longer to make than the actual work that I did on the van. The total hours are hard to say. I did several other jobs as I was doing this one. If I was just talking about the trim, I would put it around 20 hours over several days to do everything. The cost was minimal. It was around $180 total. I paid right around $125 for powder coating and another $36 for caulk and around $5 for the vinyl tubing. Remember, I started this project because of my sagging headliner. Since the front was all opened up, I did several other things that I did not mention in the video, like new drapes and drape rods for the bunk windows, new reading lights over the passenger seat for when you swivel it around that you can read at night. I stripped the fabric on the deck and replaced it with a tan color, and then I dyed the fabric on the bunk mattress more of a brown to fit in with all of our tan upholstery. In closing, I would like to thank the other members that I've talked to through the last month or so from the 0607 Facebook group. Reading what they posted and actually talking to several of them, I was able to come up with this game plan to attack my rust situation. I would say if yours is rusted, to go and get it done before it rusts through the entire trim piece. Well, this has become a long video, and I think I'll sign off. And like always, be careful out there and keep your wheels rolling.